Hello, everyone. So as you trickle in, feel free to drop where you're calling in from in the chat. And we're just going to wait a couple minutes as people trickle in and see. Yeah. Ooh, Los Angeles. Wow. Santa Cruz. Okay, lots of California. Oh, we got Illinois. Very cool. Washington. I'm personally in Sacramento, California right now. Oh, wow. Italy. Okay. Eastern Shore of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, New Jersey. Lots of different states. More California, Tennessee. For any newcomers, we're just going to be waiting a couple minutes as people trickle in. In the meantime, feel free to drop in the chat where you're calling in from. Oh, Florida. Very cool.
Seeing someone from my home country as well, Germany.
Oh, wow. I didn't know this. It's very cool.
Amazing.
Yeah. Got all over the world. Got someone from Mexico. Cool. Okay, great. Okay, so hello everyone. I think we're going to get started in the next couple minutes. So first off, this will be a conversation, so we highly encourage you guys to drop in the chat any questions you have. I do believe there's a specific Q&A where you can put your questions. So if you click on that button in the more section, you can add any questions and we'll try to incorporate those throughout the conversation. You can also just drop those in the chat, but I think the Q&A is preferred. So yeah. Okay. Oh wow, we got someone from Ghana. Hello. Okay, so I think it's been a couple minutes, so we'll get started. So hello everyone. First off, thank you for coming here to the conversation with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. So since 2007, ICAN has worked tirelessly for the abolishment of nuclear weapons, earning a Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for their efforts. And today we have the great honor of speaking with Florian Eblenkamp, an advocacy officer for ICAN who works with nuclear umbrella states and partner organizations around the world. So having earned an MA in public policy from King's College in London, as well as an MA in political data journalism from the University of Zurich, Florian is highly qualified with lots of experience to speak from. And as I mentioned before, we do want this to be a conversation. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to chime in, add that in the chat or in the Q&A. There should be a separate little Q&A section for you to add questions. So yeah, just keep that in mind throughout. And now to start us off, Florian, could you explain how ICAN came to be and what it entails today?
Yeah, thanks, Marion, and thank you everyone else for joining. And of course, I guess I should start with thanking the Red Cross and Thomas specifically for setting us up. It's really a privilege to share a few thoughts on my work, on the mission of ICAN, and sort of the wider context. And I can just underline what Marion said, that please feel free to ask as many questions as possible. Webinars sometimes, tend to have a formal appearance, but our interest is very much to keep it as informal as possible. So, I don't know, ICAN started, as so many big ideas, started very small. As you said, back in 2007, it was basically founded at a kitchen table in Australia by a few people that went to nuclear weapons conferences at the United Nations and got so frustrated by the lack of any disarmament efforts that, the nuclear weapon states would just finger point at each other, blaming others for why they cannot disarm again, but also for the fact that there's no legal basis to challenge them on. And yeah, for decades, that system kind of used to be accepted or at least not questioned enough. Also, other countries that, for example, don't have nuclear weapons didn't really pressure the nuclear weapon states to do something. And so a group of civil society advocates started to have somewhat regular calls to coordinate a bit. There's, some of you know, there's a few of these conferences every other year or so. And so you get a sense of a community feeling, and then it only makes sense to coordinate a bit who talks to who, what's in your statement, what are you going to focus on, to pressure the nuclear weapon states more. And so that became a monthly call with the idea that you create some sort of campaign as global as possible or as international as possible, to have more weight in these negotiations, and with as many organizations as possible. And then one of my great role models, Beatrice Fien, who was the former director of ICAN, at that time was an intern in one of these organizations that joined this early campaign, and had the task to facilitate these video calls every month. And then as time went on, that became an organization. It grew bigger and bigger, and eventually it became more popular to talk about a legal ban of nuclear weapons. Very much, I have to give credit to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, for example, which is a sister campaign of ours, advocating for the abolition of landmines based on the humanitarian facts about these weapons, that they disproportionately kill civilians over military personnel, and it's totally unjust the way these weapons work, and therefore there's a moral, and therefore there should be a legal case to outlaw them. So we applied that same principle to nuclear weapons, starting from what we know about humanitarian consequences of these weapons throughout their entire life, from testing, production, all the way to actual use of nuclear weapons. And of course, then talking to governments who are also not happy about the status quo of nuclear weapons, whether that should become a legally binding treaty. And then that gained momentum through different conferences and so on. And then ICAN sort of facilitated the civil society aspect of these negotiations. Eventually, that became a mandate at the United Nations General Assembly, and then a treaty was adopted in 2017 that outlaws nuclear weapons and all activities related to them. And now ICAN, of course, still exists. Our big challenge now is to implement that treaty and universalize that treaty. So you might say the work has only really started.
Yeah.
And we are a global campaign. So we're headquartered in Geneva in Switzerland, where one of the UN headquarters is. But we really have partner organizations, I think, in 112 countries. And so we understand ourselves as a campaign, not as an organization where we, hierarchically tell others what to do, but rather try to cooperate as much as possible with people in local contexts who, of course, understand the politics better, understand the campaigning in that context better, and then try to coordinate that a bit to increase the pressure on disarmament. So yeah, maybe that's a first quick introduction, but feel free to ask whatever you like about ICAN.
Yeah, of course. That was a great introductory. Thank you. And I think we actually have our first question in the Q&A. So specifically looking at the treaty that you're trying to have countries sign and ratify, what countries have already ratified it, and what are you working on which countries are you working on right now to ratify and sign?
Right. Thanks for the question. Also love that, the second question is already from the audience. Keep it up. So, of course, as every international treaty, it's open to all UN member states to sign. Currently, we are at 70 ratifications. So 70 countries have made that treaty part of their national law. And a total of 93 countries have signed it. So that's almost half of the world. I think 96 would be half. So we're I think on a good trajectory a few years after the treaty entered into force to universalize it. I think I don't know, there's different efforts, and of course that changes a lot with national politics. There's different countries from all regions of the world that have signed up to it. Some because they've had a long tradition in humanitarian disarmament, some because they have felt the consequences of nuclear weapons firsthand. So they've, for example, been testing grounds for nuclear weapons tests. others because they simply reject nuclear weapons on moral grounds, and others again because they think that that gains them political momentum in different contexts. So it's hard to pick sort of a group of countries. Again, others are part of nuclear weapon free zones already, so their commitment has been legalized even before.
Yeah.
And I think one of the next countries, what we'll see is Indonesia ratifying the treaty at the United Nations General Assembly in September. And I think Indonesia is now the fourth biggest country in the world in terms of population. So that's a significant step, of course, for us.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, congratulations. And how did you personally first get involved with ICAN?
So I guess there's a few people that are still in college or university in the chat. So let me try to bridge these questions a bit into, I get to ask a lot about how do you end up in this field, and it's really often pretty random. Also, people that I work with or that I talk to about these things. So I personally, I studied political science, and then what Marian said, public policy and political journalism later. And I had a bit of interest in like international politics, but I thought security policy specifically, it's so insanely boring because usually what happens is that you go to an event, there's all these old dudes, whose qualifications basically only that they have years of service in this industry or in this field, and therefore deny you any authority to participate in these talks. So it didn't seem really appealing to me. And then in 2016, I learned about ICAN through a personal contact, very randomly. And I thought more than anything, this is a really cool way to challenge the old dudes a bit. And it seemed accessible. It seemed something cool, something where stuff's happening. And so I became a volunteer with ICAN Germany first, and then kind of segued more into then later I was an intern at the office here in Geneva, and then eventually it became a job. But it was really more how can I say, I had a general interest for international politics, and then sort of the style of work in this office made it really appealing to work on this. And then of course the more you get into it, the more you learn about the amazing details of this work, about UN meetings and treaties, and of course you meet interesting people that very much inspire what I do, and so now I'm in a lucky position to work on this as a full-time job.
Yeah, of course. Okay, could you also talk a bit more about the importance of ICAN's mission and the dangers of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so I think, how can I say, I guess from my own biography, I went through years of formal education, both in high school and university or college in different countries. Not even once had I learned in that time about nuclear weapons treaties and how they govern it, and kind of seemed like some relic of the Cold War, or even there it was not really a problem maybe. But now we have to kind of admit that ever since the nuclear weapons were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the risk might be as high as never before. So I think the fundamental challenge is still that these weapons are just so insanely destructive that they threaten an entire species, that they basically threaten life on Earth. And so, of course, it's still relevant to work on nuclear disarmament, and of course, in a politically challenging context, even more. Now, our mission very much is to, of course, change a bit the narrative around nuclear weapons, and also enable different actors to talk about nuclear weapons. So I guess in a traditional sense, nuclear weapons were a business of those countries that dominate global politics, the US being one of them, of course. And they try very hard to not let anyone else interfere in this narrative. They're very good at protecting this, saying that their own nuclear weapons are just there for defensive purposes, that their own nuclear weapons are only there to stabilize international relations, all these ideas. And no other country should make a fuss about the disarmament commitments that these countries have signed. But of course, what the TPNW does is totally change the paradigm of nuclear weapons. You don't look at these weapons as a mere security policy or some sort of military asset, but you look at what you know from research, what happens when a nuclear weapon gets used. And it turns out research is piling up more and more that these consequences are so much graver than ever anticipated. Because of course, radiation, for example, doesn't stop in space or time. So there's really no way you can responsibly, in a military sense, responsibly use a nuclear weapon and confine the impact on a certain geographical space, or let alone at a certain time frame. And now, for example, we see that people who lived in areas where nuclear weapons were tested, for example, in New Mexico, where the Trinity test was carried out, even generations after that, the cancer rates are just incredibly high, and clearly that's a link to the test that happened 80 years ago. So if you take that as a basis, you have a very different conversation about nuclear weapons than when you look at it from a security strategy perspective. And then the other point of our work, of course, is that when you realize that no country can be protected from nuclear weapons effects because the radiation simply doesn't stop at borders, also every country should have a say about this. And with the TPNW, every country gets asked, are you for nuclear weapons or against nuclear weapons? And then, for a country that you traditionally maybe wouldn't associate with international politics, I don't know, some Caribbean island, that's kind of, what can Jamaica do to minimize the risk of nuclear weapons? They'll definitely be affected if a nuclear war broke out. So they should have a say in what's going on. And these two factors combined, the humanitarian research on nuclear weapons and sort of a more democratic understanding of international politics, make a very profound moral and then I guess also legal base for such a treaty. And that's I guess our mission to promote.
Yeah. Could you specify what does the treaty actually require of countries who ratify it?
Right. So the treaty, it has kind of two parts. One is that it's a very classic disarmament treaty. It basically prohibits all nuclear weapons related activities. So you can't have nuclear weapons, you can't develop nuclear weapons, you can't use nuclear weapons, of course. You can't modernize them, you can't station them in other territories, you can't transport them, and you can also not threaten to use them, which of course in itself is already an escalation of a military situation. So all these activities are prohibited. So if a country that has nuclear weapons were to join this treaty, there's a 10-year time period in which they have to verifiably disarm. Then there's protocols and so on. Let's not get into details yet, maybe, in which it's in very great detail specified how that has to happen. And then an international authority would control that these nuclear weapons are actually dismantled and that all capacities to build nuclear weapons are destroyed. And the other side of the treaty, it's also, I would like to call it a nuclear justice treaty, is that all countries that sign up to the treaty also sign up to a responsibility to compensate those communities that were harmed by nuclear weapons, be it from testing or using nuclear weapons, or even from producing nuclear weapons. For example, uranium has to be mined somewhere, right? And usually that doesn't go without side effects. At the same, and as well as disposing nuclear weapons, you can't just dump it in the ocean, of course. So there's a commitment to assist the victims of nuclear weapons and an obligation to remediate the environments that were destroyed or harmed by use or tests of nuclear weapons. So in that sense, it's like a two-fledged sword. I'm not sure if that's an English expression. That on the one hand disarms, make sure this doesn't happen again, but also realizes that harm has been done and that harm needs to be, or justice needs to be taken into account as well.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely important. So I know you mentioned in the past that you work with some especially difficult countries. So when you're trying to advocate for change, what are some effective strategies you use to do so?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to realize that, of course, we very often talk about the difficult countries, but the vast majority of countries actually support this, right? So that's already a very good advocacy point that not even Russia, not even North Korea is very keen on being the only odd country out there that has to justify constantly what they're doing. So I guess in more practical terms, what we do at ICAN to work in these difficult countries is that we of course maintain a dialogue with the government, be it diplomats here in Geneva, be it sometimes the State Department or the Foreign Ministry, where people are that have to formulate the position of that country to this treaty. But of course, you can meet, for example, the French diplomats every week, but their position is not going to change unless something political would happen. And so we also work with politicians, people in parliaments, in the Congress, for example, but also in local parliaments or in other countries' parliaments. Try to organize conferences to inform them about this treaty. How does this actually work? Why is it important that your country deals with this? What's the progress? How is it implemented? And of course, we work with political parties to change the majority in favor of this treaty. So we would, go to party congresses, try to lobby for wording on the treaty in the manifesto of a party. You would try to get high-profile people of a party to speak out in favor of the treaty, so that once they get elected, it's more difficult for them to walk that back. And a campaign that has picked up a lot of speed this year is that we work even on a more local level with city councils, where they can also pass a resolution that endorses the national government to sign and ratify this treaty. This comes from a background that cities are not typically associated with foreign policy, and in many countries they're not involved in that at all. But of course, in the case of nuclear weapons, these weapons would be used on a city, as they were, for example, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because that's where the harm is biggest, and therefore that's where sort of the devastating impact would be biggest, and therefore it would be cities that would have to deal with the aftermath of that. And in our understanding, therefore, also cities should have a say about nuclear weapons policy of their country. Again, this you might see a parallel here from the international system that those who are affected by nuclear weapons, and research shows that everyone will be affected, should also have a say about this. And so we try to pass resolutions in cities, capitals. In the US, it was quite successful. For example, New York has signed up, Washington has signed up. I think the state of California also endorsed this resolution and so on. So it's growing on a local level. And hopefully that it then inspires also national politicians to do the same. Then we also work with financial institutions. Many financial institutions, banks, and so on, take great pride in investing responsibly or sustainably, and obviously that would of course entail to divest from nuclear weapons companies. And once a country joins this treaty, also of course financing nuclear weapons production is prohibited. So that's sort of the three strings, and all of this happens in collaboration, or is being done by local civil society. So we would team up with, I don't know, for example, a Red Cross society in a country, or some peace group, or some other organization that would like to work with us and try to move things along step by step, one little win at a time. Oh, no, I think I've lost Mariam.
Well, oh no. Well, we can throw another. Oh, here's Marion.
Sorry, so sorry about that. I think the internet just went out, but
That's okay.
okay. So I'm guessing you just finished talking about that question. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
We actually had a question from the audience. So in specific instances where a country attacks like nuclear plants, in that instance, would ICAN address that, or does ICAN only address the use of nuclear weapons in a traditional sense?
Yeah. So it depends on how you define this attack. If there was an attack with a nuclear weapon on a nuclear power plant that's used for, civil purposes of nuclear energy, then of course that's prohibited. We would freak out, and everyone would, I hope. But the mere, existence or use of nuclear power plants in its civil use is actually explicitly permitted by this treaty, for the sheer fact that for many countries this is a potential source of electricity or of energy generation. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of that for all sorts of sustainability reasons, but we just had to pick one battle at the time there, and rather have a treaty on nuclear weapons than that allows for nuclear energy than no treaty at all, of course. Of course, if a nuclear power plant is attacked in a conflict, I guess one of the scenarios would be in Zaporizhia in Ukraine. That's highly problematic and so on, but this treaty is not the right place for sort of a legal basis for that. And also the humanitarian impact will be devastating, but it will be still nothing compared to a nuclear war that has the exchange of nuclear weapons on both sides of conflict, for example, or on various sides of conflict, I should say.
Yeah.
Not to benign this problem, but there's other treaties to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. Another question from the audience. So oftentimes you hear about the moral obligation of not having nuclear weapons and the humanitarian cause. So how convincing is this argument when you're talking to states that already have nuclear weapons or see it as a way to stay secure or safe?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it depends a bit on who you talk to, right? If it's someone with a strong military background or a career in an army, for example, there's very little understanding for these moral and sort of, what they call soft law aspects. But diplomats realize this very well, and in my experience, also the general public especially realizes this more than anyone. What we try to do, of course, is, or what many diplomats and governments try to do, is always present their own nuclear weapons as something that's just unavoidable, that they need in order to maintain their own security, to deter aggression from other countries. Big talk about that in Europe right now. But of course, our argument then is always that deterrence for one side always means escalation for the other side. So, for example, would you then be okay if the other side also maintained that same level of nuclear aggression or same level of modernization of nuclear weapons? And then very quickly you have a different discussion that actually nuclear weapons are the problem and not the solution to this problem, even though it sometimes might seem as a quick fix to a geopolitical problem that you have. But even the nuclear weapon states have committed to disarm their arsenals and state over and over that their goal remains a nuclear weapon-free world. So if someone really doesn't want to talk to you, then maybe that's something where you can start the conversation with and have them on the back foot a bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, definitely. I think we just had a raised hand. I don't know if we want to have that person unmute or.
Sure.
Yes, I can do that. Timothy, I'm going to allow you to speak and come off mute.
Yes, I have a question. How do you sign up your state? What person do you go to sign your state up on the nuclear plan?
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. So the signing is usually done by a foreign minister or a secretary of state in the US. Or equivalent, or sometimes just a diplomat at the United Nations. But of course, that's only the end of the process, right? Usually what happens before is that there's a political idea that nuclear weapons need to be outlawed, that this country rejects nuclear weapons, and these decisions need to be made in a government, whatever form that government has. And then if that decision is made, they physically sign a copy of the treaty, and then integrate that sort of international law as part of their own law. And that process is called ratifying a treaty. So the provisions of that UN treaty become part of the national law. It, for example, has to be translated, and maybe there's a country that that needs to change some national laws in order to comply with that, then that has to be done first. And once that all is done, they deposit a document of ratification with the Secretary General of the UN, and then they are a full member of the nuclear ban treaty. And I think it's a similar process for all international treaties, actually. But thanks for your question.
Another question from the audience is, how can we use grassroots activism to help ICAN implement this treaty and kind of start that process?
Yeah, I think that's actually where it all starts, and that's also where I think I take most inspiration from in my daily work. So at the end of the day, nuclear weapons politics is no different to any other field of politics, right? Politicians act on this when they feel that that they get voted for acting on this. So the more convincingly civil society, and very much in a grassroots sense, can lobby for this by, for example, holding demonstrations, doing rallies, speaking to political parties, putting up banners, creating social media pages, all the different tricks in the book. The more politicians will realize that this is actually a problem their constituents realize, and the more they will be keen to act on this. We've seen this in several countries that when grassroots civil society stands up for a certain cause, and nuclear weapons is one of them, governments can change quite a lot within a few years. Like the climate change movement, for example, of course, is a great inspiration for us, even though there's still a lot of work to do. But that really has woken up a lot of politicians after weeks of marches. With nuclear weapons, maybe we're not there yet, these giant manifestations in Central Park or so are a bit far back. But often it just helps to talk to a local office of a representative, make them realize that this is something you really care about, lay out the facts, and present what you want them to do. And then if you're persistent, and if you can sort of organize that protest a bit, then I'm sure a congressperson or a politician would also listen to that, and suddenly you're part of the conversation. So I would highly recommend this kind of grassroots activism to be organized and just get started.
Yeah, no, we should definitely call for change. Another question from the audience. So in terms of prioritization, how do you decide which states to lobby first?
Yeah, that's a bit hard, and often, honestly, we like to portray this as a big strategy, but then it often happens very differently to what we planned out. So it depends on a few factors, obviously. One is, for example, the existing position of that government. If the government's already is more or less on board, then usually we would prioritize that, of course, since it's maybe a bit easier to get that done. If that government's not yet on board, then we look at other things like how's the situation in the parliament? Is there maybe a big party that's set to take over after the next election and has a fundamentally different stance on this? Or is there a very influential civil society group that we could partner with? Is there maybe a great degree of awareness on this, like in Japan, for example, where of course nuclear weapons were used, that we could exploit, and do we have relations to the government, right? After all, you need some personal contacts to talk to people. Yeah, often that's a bit frustrating. I can openly admit there's factors that you simply cannot control, like working with a government and then they lose an election and suddenly you have to deal with a completely different bureaucracy. But that's just part of lobbying public institutions, and it can happen all the time. But yeah, we look at different factors, and then I'm try to work with whatever we can, and what we have resources for as well.
Great, yeah, totally. I know we also have some IHL YAC advocates here today that will later be presenting to US officials and politicians about international humanitarian law. So I was wondering if you have any advice to them on how to present, how to advocate for change.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a big fan of IHL, of course, and it often gets a bit, disregarded as the soft part of international politics, as something that's like optional even, or something that's a bit dreamy but doesn't live up to the real world or so. As compared to security politics and sort of military doctrines and whatnot. And something that I often like to do, and it's often very effective, is to renounce that notion and really make humanitarian law part of, make sure that people understand this is about security. Take, for example, nuclear weapons, but really every other aspect of humanitarian law also. Fundamentally, it's about real security for people, ensuring that infrastructure doesn't get destroyed by nuclear weapons. That's security. Mass starvation would be a consequence of a nuclear winter. That's real security, much more than whatever new military strategy a country might adopt or so. Take also the climate impacts of nuclear weapons. That's actual security. And if you sort of try to come at it a bit from a perspective where other people feel skeptical about, that humanitarian law is not just an add-on to everything else, but a fundamental principle of a people-centered security, then I often find the conversation gets a lot more interesting, and you have an actual conversation rather than just an agreement to disagree. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. So another question from the audience. So since nuclear weapons clearly do violate IHL, why are countries still able to openly support them? And wouldn't they be tried in international court for that being a violation?
Yep. You might be referring to the 1996 opinion of the International Court of Justice, of course, where they said that it is very hard to imagine that a nuclear weapon can be used in compliance with international humanitarian law. And in fact, of course, there's probably no way that can be done. And if it happens, it would be by sheer luck. So, of course, the use of nuclear weapons will always be a war crime. Let's be frank. It will kill indiscriminately. It will kill disproportionately, and there's no justification to do this from an international law perspective. Now, what some of these countries say, of course, is that their own nuclear weapons are only for defensive purposes, and that they don't intend to use them, but only to use them as in an abstract way to deter others to use nuclear weapons. That's of course not true, right? If you want to be credible in your own deterrence, you also have to show yourself willing and capable to actually use a nuclear weapon. And of course, that doesn't rule out the risks of accidental use of nuclear weapons, or some mistakes that are just made. But yeah, it's a discussion where diplomats get very, very defensive suddenly. And for example, that's where the nuclear ban treaty hits the mark, right there, right? That it doesn't leave a gray zone for possessing but not using nuclear weapons or so, but fundamentally rules out everything that relates to nuclear weapons. And yeah, I guess that's one of the many reasons that some of the nuclear weapon states are really aggressive against this treaty.
Yeah, no, definitely important. So another question, follow-up. How is ICAN actually going to make sure that these countries are getting rid of their nuclear weapons if they do ratify it? And yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe that wouldn't be our job anymore. Our job is to get countries to sign on. But the treaty has a provision for verification of disarmament. So countries that sign up agree to negotiate a detailed protocol with an international authority could be the IAEA, for example, in which they specify how an international body of inspectors can verify that nuclear weapons are actually dismantled. It sometimes seems, a bit complicated, but it's actually not. So I don't know, I'm not a physicist, but from what I learned is that, of course, nuclear weapons are actually really stupid, right? They're just really big weapons, but there's nothing nothing magical or secret or technologically so advanced about them that it couldn't be verified. And take, for example, a country like Iran that doesn't have nuclear weapons, but that has a protocol in place where inspections are allowed. Some of those don't even get carried out because the current political leadership in Iran doesn't allow for it. But still, even in a country that's so remote and so disclosed like Iran, the international community notices that uranium gets enriched, that some infrastructure is built that could eventually be used for building nuclear weapons and so on. So on a very practical level, it's actually not that hard to verify the existence of nuclear weapons or verify disarmament of nuclear weapons. So yeah, good question. It gets into the details of the treaty. I like it. But there's a very clear provision in this treaty, and I may add that it's actually also the only treaty that has such a provision. Everything else is just just based on declarations.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, okay, awesome. Another question from the audience. So in the case that a nuclear weapon does go off accidentally or due to human or machine error, is anyone held accountable if the country has already signed or ratified the treaty or not? Or what in the case if they haven't signed or ratified the treaty?
That's a good question. So, of course, in international law, intent is not really a qualifying problem, right? That's something for civil law, and the consequences would be as grave as they are. And then I guess it wouldn't maybe be the first worry what the legal consequences of that are. But the fundamental idea of this treaty is, of course, that this risk of an accidental use is minimized, right? That you try to prevent such an accident by actually disarming these weapons and getting rid of these weapons and removing them from as many places as possible, making sure that nothing can go wrong. They shouldn't be transported in the back of a plane. They shouldn't be on ships. They shouldn't be on submarines, not in space or anywhere. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this like accidental use of nuclear weapons is maybe something that often gets too overlooked, but actually could, of course, happen very well, be it from an actual technical error or just human error, some machine problems. There's a famous case of this Soviet general Stanislav Petrov. Maybe some of you have heard of his story, who basically refused to follow an order because he didn't trust what the radar would show, namely that there would be an American missile incoming, which would in principle require him to respond with a nuclear weapon, and he simply ignored that, and it later came out that of course prevented a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union in the 80s. And in the end, he was right. So there was a technical error that would almost led to an accidental use of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely important. We are reaching close to the 15-minute mark. So one of the last questions, where can people learn more about ICAN and its mission?
So, I mean, of course, I'm sure you all already follow us on social media. I think we're on every platform there is. There's on our website specifically, icanw.org, there's a section on partner organizations in very, very many different countries. So if you look for something to get involved locally, maybe that's a good starting point. We also have, of course, lots of materials on our website for downloads on backgrounds and so on. But trust me, nuclear weapons policy is really not that complicated. So don't worry too much about reading everything there is. So that's a good strategy. Then, of course, there's if you're already in one of these partner organizations, make sure they allow you to come to nuclear weapons conferences. There will be one in New York, for example, next year. That's accessible for the public if you register in advance with an accredited organization. And that's of course very fascinating to see the negotiations happening, right, at the United Nations, how countries actually get together and try to solve this problem. That's a good point. And more we see about the general problem of nuclear weapons, or the sheer fact of nuclear weapons, that there's movies, there's books, there's pop culture around this. So if you keep an eye out on publications and so on, I'm sure nuclear weapons will also make it to your bookshelf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think we should all try to learn more after this. So another kind of specific question, I did actually look at your website, and I noticed that on the ICAN about part of the campaign to try and advocate for change mentioned global days of action. So what does that entail? Are there any coming up?
Yeah, very, very nice question. So from time to time, we try to organize these concerted efforts where partner organizations really from around the world do something in a concerted way to show how diverse and vibrant our campaign really is. We had different ones of those. This year, specifically in September, I think it's the week of the 17th, we will have a big week of action, actually, on divesting from nuclear weapons. So the idea is that as many partner organizations as possible, or also individuals, would talk to their banks, the pension funds, the public financial institutions, try to get cities to pass resolutions that money gets divested from nuclear weapons companies. There's insane amounts of money being put in this industry. And that's a very, very effective lever, of course, to dry out the nuclear weapons business as well. So yeah, maybe check out the website for that week of action. Sign up if you have a bank account and want to talk to your bank, and we'll get you the material you need to talk to them. That's a really fascinating way sometimes, where you feel like campaign is big, but never thought it's that big, when all these people suddenly do something in the most amazing way and get like the Norwegian pension fund to divest from nuclear weapons, and that's like millions or billions out of that business. Feels powerful.
Definitely. So now we are coming kind of close to the 1 hour mark. So do you have any closing remarks? Anything else you'd like to add or specify?
I mean, also we can maybe have another question, but I think what I always like to leave people with is that it seems sometimes very intimidating to get involved in this field, be it because you had the same experience as me, that it's all these old dudes talking about it, and you feel not qualified to argue with them. Be it also that you just simply don't know who to talk to about these things, because of course nuclear weapons policy is not really something you do in your daily life. But I can just tell you, it's really not complicated. Let no one tell you that you're not qualified to talk about these things. If you understand what a nuclear weapon is, you can clearly, very quickly figure out that this is bad, and that's actually all you really need to know. And even if you don't feel qualified, then just ask questions and make other people think about it. So I guess the most important thing is to get involved. Don't let other people stop you from that. And don't let them tell you wouldn't be qualified for doing so. There's many ways, be it in colleges, being in civil society groups, be it the Red Cross, be it your bank, be it your city council or your state that could pass a resolution to join the treaty. There's so many small things that we can all do without sort of tackling the problem as a global one. And have a small win at a time, and that will add up to a big win eventually.
Yeah, no, it's important that every person speaks out, I think. So I think we have more time for another question. So from the audience, someone asked, what are some of the reasons that countries are reluctant to sign and ratify the treaty, and how do you address those concerns?
Yeah. So, I mean, some countries, some countries have a very weird attitude to nuclear weapons. Some of them are really proud of their nuclear history, for example. They, really see it as part of their national pride. At least that's what the diplomats tell us. Of course, in civil society, that's a very different picture. And what's, I guess, a common factor between all the nuclear weapon states is that they always point to other nuclear weapon states, saying that with these rogue states having nuclear weapons, we as the good guys, we cannot be the ones to disarm. But of course, that system is what brought us into this tense situation that we are in now. So they realize and see a value in the fundamental concept of disarmament, right? And so it's merely a matter of balancing out these interests rather than a fundamental support for nuclear weapons. Of course, that's a huge challenge, and it's not getting easier with the wars that are happening at the moment. But we of course try to engage with these arguments, and that's what the UN is for. That countries, even if they have different opinions, talk about these things, and eventually agree to something. Of course, that needs sort of a structure and a legal basis, and that's what the treaty is there for. And then it's on us as a civil society campaign to increase the pressure on politicians to engage.
Mm-hmm. And how optimistic is ICAN about the possibility of achieving full global nuclear disarmament in the near future?
Yeah, I must say there have been days where I felt more optimistic than now, simply because two nuclear weapon states are involved in the war. They both are backed by a huge diplomatic corps, and of course that leads to all sorts of chain reactions in other countries as well. However, we should not sort of dismiss the fact that none of these countries had been engaging with this treaty before anyways, right? And so as the membership treaty is growing, there's more and more countries opening up to it, signing it, ratifying it, and that will grow even over the next year. So it will be harder and harder and harder for the very few states that have nuclear weapons or endorse nuclear weapons on other countries' behalf to justify that. And so yeah, I'm optimistic that this is the way to go to get rid of nuclear weapons, and it's also it's the only legal and political viable way to do this. So that's where the priority for nuclear disarmament should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, any progress is good. So another question from the audience: which specific regions require more effort in getting the treaty ratified, and which regions are closest to fulfilling the ratification?
Oh, so for example, there's different nuclear weapon free zones in the world, right? For example, one in Africa based on the Treaty of Pelindaba. Then there's a nuclear weapon free zone in Latin America and the Caribbean, and one in Central Asia and one in the Pacific. So with those countries, it's usually relatively easy to sign them up to this treaty because basically all the provisions of the treaty are already in place for that country. And it's merely a matter of, making it a diplomatic priority to actually sign it. It's, of course, much more difficult in countries that either have nuclear weapons or that are part of a military alliance with nuclear weapon states, in which they're very shy to criticize nuclear weapon states. But that's kind of where our next big step will lie, I think, that we get more and more of these, what we call nuclear umbrella countries, to reject nuclear weapons and sign this treaty, and therefore allow for discussion in these military alliances to also disarm nuclear arsenals generally.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And more fun question. What makes you passionate about your work and this mission in general?
Yeah, I think honestly, what inspires me most is the people that I meet in this job. Like, of course, in my specific role, traveling is just part of it, and I really, really enjoy that. So I don't know. There's these super nice these super nice anecdotes that you travel to a different continent for a conference, and already at the airport you meet campaigners from other countries that you have seen like years ago at a different conference that have worked so much to get, I don't know, their province or their town to endorse this treaty, or their bank to divest, or work in a party to get this done. And so that's really a sense of community that's sort of featured on a global level. And what's most inspiring and a life-defining experience for me was talking to hibakusha, so people from Hiroshima and Nagasaki who actually survived the nuclear bombings in 1945. Some of you might know about Setsuko Thurlow, for example, one of our greatest, one of the best people I've ever met. She accepted the nuclear weapon, the Nobel Peace Prize on ICAN's behalf. And she was 6 years old when the US bombed Hiroshima with a nuclear weapon. And sort of hearing her story and so on is the most amazing thing I could imagine.
Yeah. And I think in the treaty, it actually specifies that not only do countries, when they ratify this treaty, are they agreeing to not have any nuclear weapons, but it also specifies some treatment of the victims from the use or testing of nuclear weapons. Would you be able to speak on that?
Yeah, exactly. So there's two sides of the treaty. One is on disarming nuclear weapons, and one is on providing victim assistance and environmental remediation. So that very much, of course, is supposed to address the harm that comes from using nuclear weapons, but also testing nuclear weapons and producing nuclear weapons. So throughout the entire life of a nuclear weapon, basically, I could say every nuclear weapon is a humanitarian catastrophe, because since the production and testing of nuclear weapons already causes so much harm, we don't even have to use it to kill people. And of course, that's just so far have been considered as collateral damage, but that's of course unacceptable, especially because these communities are often indigenous groups that are traditionally underrepresented in national politics anyways. So they don't even have a formal way on the national level to influence these decisions. And therefore, the least an international treaty should do is recognize that harm has been done and sort of try to organize efforts to address this problem. It also, maybe on a more human side, it's incredible to see when you have these discussions that nuclear weapons, from that perspective, are really also a global problem, right? If the uranium comes from specific countries. Congo, for example, is one of the biggest exporters of uranium, or Central Asian states. The nuclear weapons get tested in other countries, often on like atolls in the Pacific. Some were tested in Australia, in the US actually. And then you realize that nuclear harm is actually not just some, long time ago phenomenon that doesn't really impact anyone anymore, but it's really something that people our age would still feel the consequences of. So the treaty tries to address that. There's discussions on how that gets implemented. There's talks, for example, about a trust fund that governments should pay into, that then could, for example, pay for cancer treatments of people that were affected by nuclear testing and use, and so on. So I think it's the least nuclear weapon states should do, to at least acknowledge that there's nuclear weapons are a health issue.
Definitely, yeah, no. So I think in our final minutes, is there anything you want to reiterate about how people in the audience, anyone, everyday people, can speak out and try to encourage this mission for ICAN?
So maybe I can, in addition to what I said before, I can give sort of 3 tips on how to keep going, even though there's days where you feel like you're not going to achieve anything, or it's all going the wrong way. The first thing is network. There's an incredible network of people that work on this out there. I'm already seeing people are adding me on LinkedIn. So I mean, that's a professional network, of course, which is fine. But there's also so many organizations where you can actually, get involved yourself, be it on a very local level, but also on national levels, like the American Red Cross and others are doing, and have a sense of community in this, right? I've of course I have many friends in this field that I really value. And that of course helps to deal with times that seem difficult. Then the next thing is celebrate the small wins. You're not going to get rid of nuclear weapons in all at once. So you need intermediate steps that provide you inspiration for the rest of the campaign. So, for example, if a new city, as small as it might be, a small town in the south of Spain joins the cities appeal, then that's already a step forward. Of course, it doesn't change any country's position, but it shows how active civil society is. It gets a few people informed about this. It actually gets people to vote on this in a political decision. So that's still significant. That's great. And then the last part is, of course, try to have fun as well as much as possible. It's such a dark topic at times. Talking about all these like humanitarian consequences is really horrible. So make sure you have a few friends in that field, that every conference ends on a party, that you connect with people on a more profound way, and that campaigning is fun for you and not just an obligation that you kind of feel morally obliged to do or so. And then I think that of course helps to motivate yourself to keep going.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you again so much for coming on here today to speak with us. We're all so honored, and I hope I can speak for everyone that we learned a lot. ICAN is truly undertaking an important humanitarian initiative, and we wish you all the best in your work. As for everyone in the audience, thank you too for taking time out of your day and for your great questions. Sorry for those we weren't able to answer. Please spread what you've learned here today to your own communities and help advocate for change in whatever way you can. For both IHL, ICAN, and many other important campaigns, spreading awareness is crucial, and it's important that we all do what we can to make the world a better, safer place. So thank you, and I think that is our end.